Hello and welcome to another edition of Treasury Talent's LinkedIn Live Chats with Treasury Practitioners. Today's guest is Tony Vu. Tony is the Treasurer, Chief Investment Officer, and Assistant Vice President at the University of Colorado at Boulder. He'll be chatting with us about his career, his view of the Treasury function based on his experience across corporate, government, and higher education treasuries. So, Tony, thanks very much for joining us. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me. Happy St. Patrick's Day.
Happy St. Patrick's Day to you.
Got the shirt on for you. So.
Yeah, I know. Oh, it's a Masters shirt on top of that. Huh?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh man,
it's almost Masters Week too, isn't it? So.
It is. It is. Plenty of reasons to be optimistic. And I know you're still down in Florida, right? So you don't have to deal with the weather or anything like that.
That's right. So the job will be in Denver. Once I get a chance to move out there, I'll have to deal with all the snow. Like they just had out there, but right, I'm in sunny Miami right now. I don't know if you can tell how sunny it is here, but it's shining bright.
You got the best of both worlds. You got a job that you want, and you get to be in a place where it's still comfortable.
Well, one of the silver linings of the COVID crisis, right?
Definitely. So let's just get right into it. You started your career in corporate before moving over to government. What have been some of the highlights for you along the way?
For me, is all the different ways that I've found the next job. I mentioned this probably in my prior chat with you guys, but my first job in Treasury was through a newspaper, want ad. I know those don't exist anymore. And actually, I kept a copy for years. I don't know where it is now, but I've been recruited that way. I've been pulled from a company by a management team that moved different companies. We'll talk about networking later, but one time I was on an advisory committee. That's actually the job I got at the Miami-Dade County Public Schools. That was because I was on their advisory committee and their treasurer left. And so they asked me to step in there. And then sort of this, the new way, right, through the web, right? I'm at CU now because I saw an ad or I guess the posting pop up while I was on the AFP website. Actually, I was researching something for my prior job, and this one popped up. And I'd been keeping an eye on CU for just Denver's an interesting place. CU's a great school, but then I pulled up this job description. Like I said, all online. It fit perfectly. I swear it was like someone wrote the job description for me. I'm not gonna lie. But then the recruiting process was a fascinating thing. Going through, depends on how you want to count it, 2 or 3 different rounds of interviews, all on Zoom. It was fascinating. It was very well run. So I thought, for them to make that transition and to have run the recruitment process so smoothly, through Zoom, it spoke a lot for the organization. It gave me a lot of comfort to make the transition over. So like I said, I've been recruited in every possible way and gotten or found the next job. I think in in as many different ways as you can possibly think of, given the field. Well, I'm sure you've heard all sorts of different ways that people have been recruited.
Oh yeah, I mean it's funny. I was working a side job at one point when I was recruiting IT, and I met someone who was a QA analyst. I was doing landscape work just on the side, and he happened to be in QA or quality assurance, and I happened to need a quality assurance analyst, and I was able to place him. You just never know. The more people you talk to, what kind of conversations you're going to get into, and where it's going to lead.
These happy accidents, right?
Yeah, exactly. In the words of Bob Ross, you are correct. So, and that's incredible. I'm very happy to hear that you had a positive virtual interviewing experience. I know that was something that, as the pandemic was taking hold about this time last year, it was a concern for a lot of people, just because you go from that face-to-face to having to worry about video interviewing. And it sounds like a lot of companies have adapted pretty well, and it sounds like CU was right there with it.
Right. Absolutely. CU and governments in general, I think, had the advantage of having or requiring very structured interviews. And so you got a definite set of questions and it's less open-ended. And so that, I think that helps on the virtual space. I mean, there was an open-ended section or parts of the interview, but having that sort of questions 1 through 10 lined up, for a virtual or video call, I think works a lot better.
Definitely. Definitely. So now, having pivoted, having seen Treasury from both the corporate side and the education and higher education side, what are some of the similarities and some of the differences that you've noticed along the way?
In Treasury, huh?
Yeah,
Well, that's, I think you have to ask the question first, what is Treasury?
yeah,
And I know you've asked a few folks. I mean, I'd love to hear what you think is Treasury, but I definitely have my views on what. Actually,
sure.
I'll
You
start
want
with
me
that.
to go
What, so
first?
what do you think? What do you think is Treasury? Then we'll build from there.
Well, the way I explain it, I started off pretty much like everybody else did when I started talking to Simon. You
Hmm.
Google it, and everything that comes up is U.S. Treasury because uh, you guys are kind of the people who sit behind the curtain and pull all the levers and push all the buttons of finance that and when I never even realized that the curtain existed. So really, how I break it down, and I can partially credit you for this because I remember that from our initial conversation is it's really just understanding how the company makes money and what to do with that money, where it's allocated after that money comes in.
Sure.
That's what I've learned about it, and that's really what fascinates me about it. Is you have to be strategic, but you have to be tactical at the same time because you have to understand the ins and outs of the business in order to make the best decision for the business. You kind of have to kind of have a pulse on everything that's going on.
Yeah. Yes. And you said the key word there is money, right? And I've thought far too long about this, but it has a big impact on my job and how I do my job. And so, um, for me, Treasury, lots of different ways to define it. You can take the accountants are very well known or not well known. Like I said, actually I don't know. Is it a bad word or just a word? Another word for accounting is calling them bean counters, right? And we're not bean counters, right? Treasury, the folks in Treasury are we're the bean movers.
Yeah.
Um, the other way that I think we've talked about in the past that Treasury is, or what Treasury is, is we're the conduit to financial services for our organizations. It's sort of a succinct way of putting it. So anytime you need a financial service, whether it's banking, it gets confusing because part of the services are called treasury management, right? So it's the
Mhm.
treasury management services, debt, you need to access the equity markets, any of the capital markets. Those are all financial services, and it is a treasury role to access those services. Now, you may not have a treasurer, especially in the government space. We were talking about the differences between corporate and governments, but there are a lot of small companies out there that don't have treasurers too.
Mhm.
But you're still doing treasury. So anytime you access bank service, debt, investments, right? Whole nother area. You are performing a treasury function. You are accessing financial services. Another broader view or way to look at treasury for me and this is more government centered than corporate centered because although I think it could apply to corporate, I just haven't thought about it as much as is
Sure.
where Treasury sits in the financial or the fiscal cycle, right? Everyone, I mean, if you start on day zero with a company or a government, you start with a budget, with a plan. Like I said, in case of governments, it's always a budget. You then decide how to allocate or spend that money. Go right back to that keyword of money. And then you go and acquire what you decided to allocate, that money to. So you can either acquire people and then go through HR and a hiring process, right? That's how you acquire people. You can acquire goods and services. So that's a purchasing or procurement process. Sign those contracts, hire those folks, maybe contracts there too. And then you get to Treasury. We have to take that budget, take in all the revenues that we decided to, in this case, tax, our citizens, and then pay people, right? Or pay companies, pay our vendors, and that's that collecting and dispersing, those moving of beans, that is where Treasury sits. And then sometimes you need to borrow money because you don't have enough in the short term, or you want to do a long term plan and you want to borrow, really moving beans from the future to the present. So that's just
Mhm.
borrowing money, or letting other people use your beans while you don't need them. That's investing, right?
Yeah.
And then all of that activity gets recorded. The last thing I do in any transaction in Treasury is to get it into the general ledger. And that leads to the final step in the fiscal cycle, I call it, and that's the accounting reporting. And if you have it, either internal and everyone has external, well, at least the public companies have external reporting, as do the governments. And then the cycle starts all over again. Budget looks at last year's financial reports, creates a new budget, takes all the resources that are left over from the previous year and starts it all over again. Hire, fire people, buy goods and services, and then we need to move those monies in and out of our accounts in order to make everything happen in the end. So that's Treasury for me. And so that's a very long answer to your question. What's the difference between the two? I think the big difference is that we call it budget. You probably call it planning or some sort of forecasting on the corporate side. But everything else is, to me, is exactly the same. You're going to go through that cycle and then start over again every single year, or maybe have some long-term 3 to 5 year plans with regards to planning. And sometimes budget on the government side. But then it, like I said, just goes round and round and round and round. And that's why Treasury has to have that both tactical and strategic view of things, because we're constantly having to move in and out of that day-to-day mentality and switch over to that long-term mentality, especially in the debt and the investment side, to make sure we're in the right place. We have the money in the right place at the right time, and the right amounts too, obviously.
That makes sense. And it sounds like the primary difference is being just really where that money comes from, right? It's opposed to revenue from selling goods and services, depending on the type of business you're in. It's essentially tax money that's coming in, or bond or grant money, whatever it may be, right?
Exactly. And with that source, that money's taxes, right? Yeah. And sometimes you get them from fees and whatnot, and so you get some enterprises. But let's just talk about taxes. Comes a lot of regulations and accountability. But it's tough to measure accountability on the government side, because on the corporate side, I know I oversimplify things, but and then if you make money, you're doing fine, right? Stock price goes up, or you're going to get your bonus. It's pretty easy to measure whether or not you're doing. Number one, you're doing your job, and if you're doing well, right, you're going to make a profit of some kind. In government, how do you measure that? We can't make a profit. That's actually that's not doing very well, right? We're not using the resources, I think, as efficiently as we should. And so you start looking at outcomes. What is the graduation rate? In the case of K-12, what is our high school graduation rate? And for higher ed, it's what is our 4-year rate, our 6-year rate, and getting our graduates out there. You can have arguments about whether or not the degrees the students get are useful or not, but I got to tell you, I don't think I'm indifferent or even agnostic to that. The degree, shows what your interest was, but completing it shows your ability to stick to something, and really certifies to the world that you've done something, right? And in the case of the U.S. higher ed education system is usually something pretty good. Hopefully you can think critically. Hopefully you're going to be a lifelong learner, and that you can contribute to any organization you join.
Yeah, no, that's great advice and great insight too. I mean, it kind of goes down maybe a different path with deciding which fields to go into or which degrees to pursue. But I kind of look at it as no one's forcing anyone's hand in terms of what field they choose. So as long as you complete the degree, it does show, to your point, an achievement, a milestone, and shows your ability to continue to develop and challenge yourself. So.
Right. No, absolutely. And you can argue about the certification aspects of it, but that's the tail wagging the dog.
Yep.
That certification isn't required by universities. That certification is required by the hiring entity, right? We're the one that says you need a 4-year degree or master's degree in order to even apply for a job. But if that changes, I think higher ed in the K-12 system, but higher ed more closely to what I'm doing now, will adapt to that. And actually, that's what we've done. We've adapted to that for so long, especially on the corporate side, right? Look at the MBA space. It used to be very few people got MBAs. Now you basically can't not get it, right? It is a required certification to move up in the in business, especially in finance. I mean, that's the space I know, right? You're not going to get very far without an MBA.
Yeah.
You know,
Absolutely.
you can have arguments about whether or not it's useful or not, but that's a whole nother discussion, right?
Hey, I think we've talked about it before. The more acronyms or more initials you can put behind your name, I'm a big fan of, because it only means that you're achieving more and that you have more subject matter expertise.
I just think I run out of space at some point in time, though.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. You put the entire alphabet back there, maybe sometimes a couple of times over, and what do you have left to accomplish? So.
Yeah, exactly.
From a career standpoint, what advice would you give to someone looking to make the move from corporate into higher education or government, and vice versa? Because I hear a lot of, well, they're different industries, but they sound like they operate, at least in the same church, maybe different pew type scenarios, what I'll say.
Oh, with it, especially Treasury, like I said before, it's exactly the same. It's actually more exciting, to tell you the truth. I remember on the corporate side, you're either in a borrowing stance or an investing stance. And if you're investing, you're most likely doing a money market, sort of some sort of short-term investing, unless you're just in some not even large corporates, so mega corporates, right? I'm sure they're doing some very different things. But in the government space, you do both. I won't go into the details of fund accounting, but it creates this environment where you're both investing and borrowing. At CU, I think that our debt portfolio is just under $2 billion. A mix of taxable and tax exempt, fixed and variable, and then adding in some short-term pieces that should be turned into long-term pieces over its life cycle. That, like I said, keeps me on my toes. And then if you ever worked in the tax exempt space, it's very different than going out for a credit facility or issuing corporate bonds. The regulations and sort of the rules in place because of tax exempt status and keeping that status can get pretty complex. You actually have to have a pretty robust team, I guess, to go up to tax exempt debt. On the investing side, well, it depends on how you count the portfolio, right? It could be, it's just under $3 billion under management, assets under management that are directly under me. But I actually serve as the co-fiduciary for all of the DC plans. I'm sorry, the contributions. I never can remember what DC stands for. That's about $4 billion there. And that's something I'm actually having to get my head around. And like I said, so it keeps me on my toes on the government side. But the advice I would give to folks is that, and it won't work for everyone, but it's easy for me to get out of bed and go to work every morning. I feel like I make a difference. And if I would have known earlier, I probably would have jumped into this space much sooner. The first dip into this was actually at Florida International University when I got the role there. And that's actually the first place I became treasurer. And it was a different feeling going to work every morning than in my prior roles. There's certainly nothing wrong with I sold, or for cruise lines of selling cruises or literally selling paper, or forms and other roles and selling houses. There's nothing wrong with those things. But when I woke up to work for FIU, and then when I woke up to work for, Miami-Dade County Public Schools, 350,000 students there, it's a different feeling than when I was in the corporate space. And if you're looking to make a difference, government needs your help. They can use your talent. The other thing I would say is that I'm not starving. It isn't, a space where you just, certainly the pay scales are going to be a little bit different, but you're, I've read far too many articles about pay and the correlation with happiness, and there is no correlation, right?
Okay.
But working for government, it's going to be hard. It's harder actually, right? We heard all of the stories about regulatory relief for the corporates. With the last administration, there is no regulatory relief coming for governments anytime soon. Nobody wants to do that, politically. So it's always going to be tough, and it'll probably just continue to get tougher on the regulation side. But like I said, in the end, I feel like I'm making a difference here at CU. I made a difference when I was at MDCPS, and it made a difference at FIU too.
Yeah. And how did you go about bridging that gap from the corporate side to the government side as you were interviewing? Was it just taking past experience and showing how it's applicable to the challenges they were facing on the government side? Was there some sort of catalyst there? What was the trick for you?
Yeah, you know what? The trick was, it was a Treasury job, and I remember the treasurer that hired me at FIU. It was, we had a short conversation about it, but it was very easy for him. He's like, I needed a Treasury person to come in and help me. I didn't need another finance person. I didn't need an accounting person. I needed someone with Treasury experience. It didn't matter where I got that experience, and he was absolutely right. It was. The way I put it is that I had to learn a lot of stuff to get higher ed under sort of under control and get my arms around it. Yeah. But it wasn't a matter of learning where what the framework to put it in from a treasury perspective. I just had to learn a different terminology or like I said, different revenue sources, but I knew where to put it as a treasury person. Okay, that's incoming money, that's outgoing money. We need to borrow here. We need to invest here. Those are all very similar across, governments or corporates, right? So that change or that transition was very straightforward. And I think my transition actually from the corporate to the higher ed space in that respect was probably the easiest of the transitions. The tough transition, and maybe a lot of your folks that listen to this will agree, or if they've gone through it or haven't gone through it, they'll see it when they deal with it, is a transition from a smaller or mid-sized organization to a larger organization. And that was the case from FIU to Miami-Dade County Public Schools. Yeah. FIU was, they'll say they were $1 billion, but they were probably around a $600 million budget organization. Everything's measured by budget on the government side, right? So, okay. But we'll say that there's $1 billion budget there. MDCPS was $5 billion, and you would not think it would be that much different, but it was worlds difference between the two. The size is, I always say, the size is its own complexity, right? We had debt payments at FIU, but they were always on December and June. We had debt payments at MBCPS, but they were all over the place because the $200 million debt portfolio at FIU didn't compare to the $3 billion in debt at the school district. And so every other week, I swear there was a debt service payment going out the door. When prior to that, I just had to worry about it 2 times a year. CU, same sort of situation, but actually they structured their debt differently. So I'm back to 2 times a year, but the size is still comparable to what was at DCPS, and so the transition was a lot easier. That, like I said, making that jump. I actually always joke that if I were on the hiring committee for the Miami-Dade County Public Schools, I wouldn't have picked me because that jump was too big, to tell you the truth. Certainly, obviously I managed it and was able to do well. But if anyone is out there that's sort of thinking about that or looking at that or having to make that jump, it is a learning curve to increase in like I said, complexity, increase in complexity just because of the size.
Sure. Sure. And it follows the theme to what you've been talking about, right? Like the core function, the fundamentals are the same. It's just maybe
Absolutely.
different terminology, and the money's going different places and probably called
Absolutely.
different things.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. So being a part of higher education, what opportunities do you see to get college students more involved in Treasury or in the Treasury career track at the start of their careers instead of pretty much what we're doing now, transitioning through traditional accounting and finance backgrounds?
I have no idea. But this is something I'm actually very interested in, and really this is for the Treasury community to answer. We need to stop responding to your question about what are you looking for in a candidate. We need to stop responding to that with I need a bright person that can learn Treasury. We need to start answering with, I need a person that has chosen to study Treasury and can step into this role. Anyone that I've have open or available to them, so that we have a ready pool, a ready bench of. Can you hold on just a second?
Mhm. Just a brief pause here while Tony's going to join us. Here we go.
So, the joys of working from home.
Exactly.
Everyone's out of school now, and so they're having their fun. And I feel bad having to break it up for them, but they're just going to move it to another room. But I think I was saying that it's incumbent upon the Treasury community to start deciding how we want to do that. All the training is there. We were talking about the connections between bankers and Treasury, professionals. We're really just two sides of the same coin. And so if we can train bankers and students or graduates know they want to go into banking, we can certainly train Treasury folks to come work on either the corporate or government side, to interact with the very same bankers that are out there. How do we do it? Like I said, I don't know. And I hope this is sort of the first call out to everyone. So anyone listening to this, reach out to me on LinkedIn, wherever. Let's figure this out together. I think a few people, I've already mentioned that on these podcasts, and I'd love to reach out to them, and then put something together. Like I said, I'm lucky to be at a university now. I think we can, start formulating, at least a framework, and then maybe even put together. Yeah, you start small. You say, start with a lecture. Do a lecture every single year about Treasury. It turns into a class, because obviously 1 hour or 2 hours even isn't enough to talk about Treasury and all the different aspects of Treasury. Eventually that course will take on its own life and turn into maybe a certificate. Is usually the path that happens on the higher ed side. And then from a certificate, I think you can build from there. I don't think it needs to be a full degree, but I got to tell you, you get a finance degree with a Treasury certificate, I'm going to be looking at you pretty hard as an undergraduate, right? But I think it goes back to that other question. It's tough to define what is Treasury first. If you can't define what is Treasury, and you have to use the word Treasury to define it, you're sort of failing, right? Too many times I've read, what is Treasury management? And the answer is, that's the management of Treasury. And that tells me absolutely nothing, right? And so imagine if you're an undergraduate, you don't even know what the word Treasury means. And the closest thing you've come to Treasury is being treasurer of your high school club. It doesn't make any, you're not going to make any headway there, right? Although it's a whole nother conversation. The connection between being a treasurer in a club and being a treasurer in any of the roles, the modern treasurer role, that actually is I think would be a fascinating discussion in and of itself. There is a reason why, there's a president, vice president, treasurer, and a secretary typically in a club, and why that role has persisted into the corporate, into the government space. But that's all wrapped into that definition of what is Treasury. And like I said, so the answer is, I don't know how to do it, but I do know that you need to start much earlier than mid-career for folks to step into Treasury. And or I mean the rotation programs are excellent. I never went through one, but I can imagine if you went through a rotation program. Well, actually, what I can't imagine is that if you've gone through a rotation program and if you got exposed to Treasury on the corporate side, why you would choose anything else? Because it's just, that is where all the fun is, right?
Yeah.
No. No, I don't really kid. This is where all the fun is. This is why Treasury people love Treasury, right?
Yeah.
On the corporate side, especially on the public side, you talk about issuing stock. Where does it happen? It happens in Treasury. That's where that discussion is happening. Although I would argue we probably focus on stock too much. Not everyone issues equities or talks about shares and whatnot, but almost everyone has to deal with debt at some point in time. So you probably should focus more on debt and then branch out to the equity side, at least from a teaching and building up a course of study. But that's a whole nother, once again, a whole nother conversation that we could have about that.
But it's fascinating at the same time, though, because we've had guests on who talk about one of the things they do when they start a new treasurer position or they start in treasury leadership is they'll put decks together and explain to the rest of the company what treasury actually does.
Right.
That's the perfect recruiting tool. If you're looking to hire an entry-level analyst or something like that, go to your local university and just give a presentation on what treasury is to a finance or an accounting class, and then just start to generate that conversation. I think there's a huge opportunity for universities and corporates to really start to partner to develop some sort of pipeline or funnel to really get people involved in the track much earlier.
Yeah. Oh, so maybe that should be a part of my call. If you have a deck describing treasury, send it to me. Send it my way. Send it through Joe, and I'll start compiling that and putting it together. And putting, at the very, like I said, I think it's very straightforward, at least from a higher ed standpoint. It really is that lecture, course, certificate, and then, like I said, maybe even a full degree at some point in time. But that's, that's a long way out in the future. But we can do the lecture for sure.
Well, sure, you'll have to build it brick by brick, but it's no reason not to start as soon as you can, right? Because I mean, from a hiring perspective, we find ourselves having the same conversation with treasurers over and over and over, which is, you're not necessarily, you don't have a new pool or a new pool of people who's entering the workforce in treasury every year. You're going to have to kind of grow your own.
Right. And then the government space is even scarier. Not that we need, we do need more treasury folks, but last I checked, there's about 90,000 governments in the U.S. alone, and that's not even counting the federal and the state levels. And then states have their own treasurers too, and have to deal with cash management and all that fun debt investments too. So let's say 90,050, right? Because you have 50 states. But every single one of those governments have to deal with all the treasury issues we need to deal with. Now, a big chunk of them also only have one person to do that, and the budgeting, and the purchasing, and the accounting. But that doesn't mean we can't provide the training for all those folks. We mostly have talked about the differences between government and corporate. The other big difference is governments aren't going anywhere anytime soon, right? Even if we go debt bankrupt, which rarely happens, by the way, it just doesn't happen. It's literally just a basis point versus percentage points of defaults on the corporate side. And even if we do default or go bankrupt, there's still going to be that government there, right? And so, in the larger the government, the more just like large organizations, the more likely there's a specialized or specific treasury area. Almost every single government issues some type of debt or bonds, especially of any size government. You sort of can't get away from it, right? And then you can sort of also pick a specialty. If you want to do cities, and you go to your municipalities. If you want, like I said, like I did, K-12 space, and you're interested in education. I don't know if you're interested in water, you can help run the water districts that are all out there. Utilities, public utilities. If you're in the private utility side, I'm sure that the public utility is very similar You can make that transition over. And so there's a lot of opportunity to learn, like I said, specifically Treasury, in a very demanding space. And I think, I haven't tested it to go back to the private side, but I don't think I would have any problem stepping into a corporate or private Treasury role. I actually think it'd be easier because the regulations would be, to tell you the truth, a lot less demanding on that side. But then everything else would be pretty familiar with respect to investments and blocking and tackling the cash management side. That's not going to be anything different than what's happening on the government space.
Yeah.
You were gonna say?
Oh no, I was agreeing with you, and okay. I think one of the main differences I remember in our initial conversation you were talking about was just government. You don't always get to choose your stakeholders, right? They're elected officials, and you guys have to play nice. You have to find a way. It creates a unique perspective from stakeholder management and partnership.
Right. It isn't a. I'm not saying that all boards are handpicked, but it is not an appointed board. Right.
Yeah.
Although there are governments that have, I guess pseudo or quasi governments that have these appointed boards. But elected officials have, there's changes that happen there. Number one, and like I said, they sometimes have different objectives and goals than the prior officials or board that was in place. And that definitely adds a different dynamic to it. It's but that's part of the challenge that I like on this space, and CU is actually exactly that. I mean, I don't know how prevalent it is across other higher ed institutions, but at least at CU, it's a 4-campus system. The big one being at Boulder. That's the one probably everyone knows. But the fascinating thing is that the 9-member board of regents are all elected. Across I think there's 7 congressional districts, 1 from each, and then 2 at large that get elected statewide. So that to me is part of the fun of doing this and serving, in this case, the citizens. Actually, not just the citizens of Colorado, but all those citizens that come into Colorado and get an higher ed education, through the CU system. It's like I said, I can't say it enough. It's very gratifying to be in this world.
That's awesome, and I'm happy to hear that you've made that move. I know we are past our allotted time. Do you have time for a little bit more questions? Or a few more questions?
Sure. Were there any questions out there I needed to handle, or
let me take a look.
Wanna?
I'm gonna throw this on mute just real quick because it always starts. Give me 2 seconds. It looks like we are all set for the time being. No questions from the audience. So
yeah, and I didn't know if I was on mute, but I was going to say, if anyone has any questions, certainly you can put it in the comments and or message me directly. I'd be happy to respond and send that answer that at a later time.
Yeah, it's you've been great about being an open networker. I know I've introduced you to a couple of people, and you've been more than willing to have conversations about the difference between corporate and government and everything about that. So you've been a great resource. And again, thanks for joining us, taking the time again to revisit a conversation that you had with Simon, and you gave some great insight. I really appreciate the time today.
Thanks. I listened back to these interviews. And then they're not very helpful for advancing my career, but that's not the goal of these interviews for me. It truly is to help the community. It's truly to help, hopefully recruit and bring some folks into the government space. I think we need that help and that expertise out there. And so for me, it's a little bit different focus and different goals for these calls. So I appreciate you giving me a platform and the time to do that.
Of course. Well, with that, we'll cut you loose. Thanks again for joining us, Treasury community. Thanks for tuning in, and we will talk to you later.